To have you join us today. This is the final April session in our Wednesday webinar series. For those of you who have been joining us, you know that we've been providing these bite-sized topics related to what is timely and urgent in grant seeking. Today, we will have about 20 minutes of content, and then we'll move into some questions and answers at the end. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. If you've been here before, we're so glad to have you back. We have just launched our May schedule, so following today, I hope you will all sign up for our continued series that will begin again in the coming month. My name is Dana Textoris. I am a managing director at Grants Plus, and I am so pleased to have with us today Christine Donovan, who is a donor services and development officer at the Columbus Foundation. As we get into today's content, I know you'll be as glad as I am that we have Chris with us. So as we're getting started, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. We, as mentioned earlier, everyone is on mute. So if you have crying babies, barking dogs, we'd love to hear them, but no worries. Throughout the presentation, you'll notice that there is a little Q&A feature, and we invite you to submit any questions that you have. There will be time at the end for questions, so please don't be shy and do chime in. Your questions will only help us enrich the discussion. So let's jump in with some introductions. For those of you not familiar with Grants Plus, we are a firm of professional grant seekers who partner with nonprofit organizations to help them be more successful in grant seeking. And we've been doing this since 2007. So that was right before the last major economic crisis, meaning we've been through this before. We've helped organizations get through that last crisis, and we are committed to helping them get through this one as well. To give you a little bit of background about me, this is my 7th year with Grants Plus, and prior to being part of Grants Plus, the majority of my career was in individual fundraising on the West Coast. And so today's topic, I'm really pleased to be able to share it with all of you, because it really does blend aspects of grant seeking with aspects of individual donor fundraising. And now I'd like to invite Chris to introduce herself and share a little bit with us about the Columbus Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start with a little bit about the foundation, and then I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. The Columbus Foundation, you can see on your screen, we just celebrated our 75th year of serving Central Ohio and beyond through our donor advised funds. We hold about $2.6 billion in assets, and so we're always in the top 10 in terms of largest community foundations in the nation. I think this year we're 6 or 7. And we give out, last year I should say, we made $250 million in grants, which is about normal for us for a typical year. Our competitive grants process serves almost exclusively Central Ohio with a few exceptions, so Franklin County, Ohio, and then the contiguous counties. But our donor advised funds go all over the world. They go really wherever the donor advises us that they send them. So we have a fair amount of flexibility with donor advised funds. As for me, I am a lawyer by training. I also earned my CFRE in 2018. And I've been a fundraiser since 2012. Like many of you, probably I didn't dream of being a fundraiser as a little girl, but you find it and you love it and you realize that it works well for you. Prior to joining the Columbus Foundation, I was able to work as a fundraiser in very large institutions like Ohio State, which is about as big as it gets from a fundraising perspective, on down to smaller organizations raising a few $1 million, which is not the smallest they can be, but certainly much smaller than the scope of Ohio State. I've been at the Columbus Foundation for less than a year now, but it has been very illuminating to move from being a grant seeker to a grant maker. And so I hope I'll be able to share some of that with you today.
Thank you so much, Chris. So let's get into today's topic. To ground us a bit, I'll remind you that we have been having conversations with those of you who've been joining us about some immediate steps that we've advised you can take to strengthen your grant seeking during this time of crisis. And our advice has really boiled down to a few key themes. And those include, one, communicating with your current funders, which is so important because you cannot assume that they understand how the crisis is affecting your organization. And so being proactive to communicate with them is definitely step number one. Secondly, seeking out emergency funding as appropriate, both from your current funders and from emergency response funds that have been released around the country. And this also includes federal emergency grants and SBA loans. Information about all of this is available on our website and in a resource page that we'll share following today's webinar. And then thirdly, our advice has been, even as you are paying attention to what you can do now, don't forget to look to the future and continue cultivating a pipeline of future donors and funders, because the show is going to go on and we can't stop now, or else we'll only make our situations more difficult later on. Now today we're going to switch gears a little bit and delve more deeply into a more narrow aspect of grant seeking, and that is getting grants from donor advised funds. This area is really just as important as traditional aspects of grant seeking. And so we're going to cover three areas today that I hope will give us all an opportunity to make sure that we're taking the right steps. One, Chris is going to give us an orientation to what donor advised funds are, so we have a shared understanding. Secondly, we'll talk about how you should be connecting with your existing donors who may already be giving to your organization through donor advised funds. And then also, how do you open doors and create opportunities to benefit from support from new donor advised fund donors? So with that, Chris, why don't you take us into some background on donor advised funds?
Sure, thanks, Dana. I always tell donors that the biggest benefit of donor advised funds is that it allows donors to separate the timing of when the tax law says that giving is wise or tax efficient from when the donor thinks that giving is meaningful. So donors can make a contribution to a donor advised fund. They get a tax deduction when they make the gift for the full amount of the gift. So if a donor gives $100,000 to a donor advised fund, they get the full $100,000 tax deduction that they would normally get based on whatever their tax situation is, and then they can distribute those funds over time. They might distribute the full $100,000 immediately. They might distribute it over a year, 2 years, 5 years. They might even be sort of building up a fund to be a philanthropist more in their retirement. Whatever. That's the benefit of donor advised funds, is that they're very flexible. They kind of serve as a bank account in a sense, because the donor can give into it when they want and then grant out whenever it makes sense for them. Community foundations are one of a couple of institutions that manage donor advised funds. At the Columbus Foundation, we are a community foundation. There are also donor advised funds with financial services companies like Fidelity Charitable, Schwab, Vanguard has one as well. Fidelity Charitable at this point is actually the largest community foundation in the country, but obviously it has a very different feel, and some argue that they have a different set of motives. We won't get into that today. In terms of from a fund grant seeker perspective, I'll briefly address some of the differences between how funds function that are at community foundations versus at financial services institutions. With community foundations, the biggest benefit is essentially the expertise of the foundation and the experience of the donor. Donors can have a much higher touch experience with a community foundation. We are experts in our local community. With a financial services institution, often fees are a little bit lower, but you're not going to get as much of a hands-on experience. So if you see a donor advised fund grant coming to you from a financial services institution versus a community foundation, tax-wise, it's all the same. It doesn't make a difference. It tells you something about the experience that the donor received, but that's about it. Otherwise, there's not a lot of difference for you as the fund raiser, the grant seeker, minus on the question of sort of stewardship and relationship building. One thing to think about that I realized over the years in my own experience as a fundraiser, trying to call up a contact at Fidelity Charitable and build a relationship with them so that more money will come to you, it's not going to happen. And they were very honest with me about that. So if you are receiving donor advised funds from a Fidelity or a Schwab or a Vanguard Charitable, by all means call them if you have questions about the gift, but don't feel the need to cultivate a relationship with anyone over there, because they typically, I will say always, because I've never seen it happen, they are not providing direction to donors. They are more just following the donor's advice and getting the check out the door. With community foundations, we, when asked, provide recommendations to donors, so it makes a little bit more sense to get to know us. So I'm trying to save you a little time. I hope that helps. In terms of with donor advised funds, they've grown tremendously. The first donor advised funds were created in the 1930s, and they weren't really regulated until the late 60s, I believe, but they have been booming since then. You can see here, assets in donor advised funds have grown so much, even just between 2015 and 2020. Now it's, I mean, there were 121 billion, and now it continues to grow further and further. Donor advised funds also pay out almost 4 times the rate of private foundations. So private foundations are only required to pay out 5%, whereas donor advised funds, donors can give as much as they want or as little as they want, but the average has been over 20% of dollars going into donor advised funds go back out every year for every year on record. So there's no guarantee of how much will come out of a donor advised fund, but it does tell you something about how much the money can flow in and then flow back out. In terms of thinking about how you as a fundraiser manage donor advised fund gifts, it's really important to think about them from the perspective of who is driving the money to your organization. It's technically all the money is coming from the community foundation or the commercial gift fund, because the assets belong to the community foundation. That is necessary in order for the donor to receive the tax deduction. So a donor gives $100,000 to the Columbus Foundation. We then, the Columbus Foundation, we own the assets. We are going to follow the advice of the donor as long as it's legally advisable to do so. I mean, if they're trying to violate the law, we can't do that, but otherwise we're going to follow their instruction. Their advice. It is not instruction. So the gift will come to you saying it is from, for example, the Columbus Foundation. Buried in that information, look in the paperwork and you will see typically the name of the fund and the name of the donor. That's not always true. Some donors do prefer to remain anonymous, but Fidelity reports that 90% of donors choose to share information directly with the organizations that they support. So generally, you will be able to find out the name and contact information of the donor. Often it'll be a donor that you know. Great. Put that person in your database as a soft credit to the gift. So as you enter the gift, and it is technically a gift from the Columbus Foundation, but it is soft credited to Christine Donovan, then you can still have the information for Christine Donovan as you try and think about, who am I going to be cultivating? Who am I prioritizing? And getting all of that information actually into your database is critical, first of all, for record keeping, but also so that you have reliable data that you can pull information and you see that that $25,000 I sent you came from me, even though it looked like it, technically it came from the foundation, yes, but it came at my advice. And so it's important for you to think about me as your donor so that you can treat me as such and cultivate me as such for the future. Dana will get into a little bit more of the details of how to steward those donor advised fund donors, because it's absolutely critical that as you're thinking about who is really the driver of why the money is coming to you, that is a top priority. So Dana, why don't you talk a little more about stewardship?
Thank you. And I'm really glad that we have this opportunity to emphasize how important it is to think about that individual donor, track their information, and steward them just as you would other significant donors to your organization. And this really is something of a misperception, that a donor advised fund is like an iron gate that's intended to block contact with these donors. But a donor advised fund, as Chris has explained, is simply the vehicle this donor is choosing to give through. Just as with any donor who's giving to your organization, you have to learn their preferences for communication, their preferences for interaction, and not assume they don't want to be thanked, appreciated, or involved simply because they've given through a donor advised fund. This may be an individual who cares and who wants to engage more deeply, so don't make the grave mistake of potentially ignoring them and missing this opportunity to grow opportunities for them to continue their giving. So how do you do that? Well, it starts with the simple basics that you apply to all donors who are giving to your organization. When you receive the gift, send a thank you note immediately to the donor. Unless it's made explicitly clear, do acknowledge the donor. Provide them with the same personalized attention and updates that you're sending to other donors. And of course, if they've explicitly stated they don't want this contact, well, then you will abide by that and respect their wishes. But even if a gift is anonymous, there are even steps that you can take. And Chris actually shared this with me, that it can be very helpful if you remember someone in Chris's position as a donor services officer. She is looking for opportunities to take good care of her donors. And so if you receive a gift from a donor who wishes to be anonymous, send a gift to Chris, send a gift to the manager of the donor advised fund, send a thank you letter and ask them to pass it along to the donor. That way we're respecting their anonymity, but you're still taking a step to show your appreciation. So this is something that always applies. Always, you should be paying good attention and stewarding your donor advised fund donors. But this is especially important now. And that's because grants from donor advised funds are surging. And all types of institutions, whether it's the commercial institutions or the community foundations, they are reporting much greater giving in this recent period through donor advised funds than in other periods. And they're also reporting that donors who have donor advised funds are expressing more intention to increase their giving now than other donors. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Donors with a donor advised fund have raised their hand. They have made an investment in their ability to be philanthropic. And they now have the opportunity to disperse those funds through their donor advised funds. So this is why it's very important that you take steps to share with them the opportunity to give to your organization. And that is what is really a next step. There is an opportunity now to activate this willingness and desire that donor advised fund donors are expressing to give. And that starts with the donors who've already given to your organization. So Chris has explained to us how we should be recognizing when a gift from a donor advised fund donor arrives. And if you have been doing that, if you have good records, pull that information now. Pull that list of the donor advised fund donors who've already been giving to you. Prepare something to share with them your gratitude for their past support, the impact that the crisis is having on your organization now, and the opportunity to make a big difference by directing a gift now to your organization. And of course, this can apply to all of your significant donors, alerting them to the opportunity and the need to support your organization now, but especially with donor advised fund donors who may have these funds available to disperse. Next, how do you think about expanding the pool of donor advised fund donors who can support your organization? Can you invite them to participate, to join in supporting your organization? Now, this is an understandable challenge for organizations. You can't research donor advised fund donors to learn about their interests and giving preferences. There isn't a formal application process to request gifts through donor advised funds. So where does this leave organizations who want to increase grants from donor advised funds? Well, the starting point is always your existing relationships. And if you have taken steps all along the way to maintain good relationships with your contacts at community foundations, then you may be a step ahead now, because and Chris, you can, I hope, speak to this. Donor services officers are most likely to turn to their colleagues who are the program officers at foundations to learn from them what are the organizations that are doing good work, that are in need of support. And so if you've maintained good relationships with those program officers, they may be your advocates now with their donor service officer colleagues. Chris, is there anything that you'd like to add on to that?
I would like to reiterate your point because I think you're really hitting the nail on the head, Dana. When I have a donor who says to me, Chris, I really believe passionately about foster care or about solving issues related to homelessness, who do I support? I know plenty of organizations in my own community, but I would much rather turn to the program officers because they know the full spectrum of what organizations are working right now, which ones are in dire need, which ones are struggling, which ones are poised to actually do something with the funds. So I always like to look to my colleagues in the program office because frankly, they're more the experts in the community than I am.
Thank you. And now let's go into another step that is maybe a little bit more aggressive. So, you've had good relationships with your program officers, but what about the donor service officers? Can you directly contact them? Can you look to them to put your organization on the radar of the donors they serve? And the truth is, it depends. Whether this kind of a direct approach is going to work with a donor service officer, it depends on his or her personality, their preferences, their relationships with their donors. And this is because some donors already know exactly what organizations they want to support. They aren't looking for these recommendations, and some are. So it's not a given, but it is possible that a donor services officer might be open to learning about your organization and perhaps sharing that information with his or her donors. And in our next slide, we're going to share with you some specific ways that you can attempt to do that. And then we'll open up to questions because Chris may have a few things to add, and I'm sure some of you may have questions. So let's go to this final slide here, which is really, if you are making an approach to see if a donor services officer will be open to you, how do we recommend you do that? Well, we recommend, first of all, that you tread very cautiously and that you are very conscious that this is something that you're going to try, but it isn't necessarily a guarantee. And you really want to remember that a donor service officer's responsibility is first and foremost to her donors and not to nonprofits. So just keep that in mind. But if you are making this approach, start by requesting a brief conversation, maybe 15, 20 minutes via phone or video, and then prepare a succinct, compact introduction to who your organization is, what you are doing, and why you are relevant and support is needed now. If that conversation goes well, absolutely, no matter what, follow up, express your gratitude, be appreciative, but you might also even ask permission to send a brief report in hopes that either this is going to remind the donor services officer of some of the good points you've shared and possibly even be something that he or she may share with her donors. So we see that many questions are coming in, and there's some good conversation we can have there. And since we have only a few minutes, why don't we jump right into that?
Sure, Dana, a couple of questions have come in already. The first one is, how do you best recognize donor advised funds publicly? So in an annual report or something like that, not just a thank you letter.
Well, I will quickly, say again that it's really important always with donors to abide by that donor's preferences and wishes. And so certainly if they've chosen to make their gift anonymous, then that kind of public recognition isn't appropriate. But if they haven't, then it is appropriate to recognize that donor. Chris, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I'll add a piece that might be a question behind the question, which is one that I have struggled with in former lives as a fundraiser. And it's kind of, in my mind, partly a question of, do I recognize the owner of the assets who got the money to me, or do I recognize the person whose motivations made the gift happen? And me as a stickler and a lawyer, my instinct is, well, no, we got to put the name of the foundation because that's who was on the check. But over time, I have frankly softened on that very, very much. Ultimately, annual reports are about stewardship. Them not being exactly the letter of the law is okay. Stewardship is about relationships. And so what towards the end of my time as a fundraiser, before I moved over to the foundation, I always recognized those gifts as coming from the donor, not from the foundation. So I wouldn't put, well, the Columbus Foundation gave us a total of this much money, which I knew was the background. In the background, it was from 10 different people who all gave through donor advised funds. I just recognized the gifts from the donors who advised the money to come out from their donor advised funds. So if that's the question behind the question, that's how I would answer it.
Great, thank you. We actually had two similar questions come in from slightly different angles, but and Christina, I think this is aimed at you. If you are not able to connect with a donor services officer or can't get a call back, does it make sense to send a 1 or 2 pager directly without that discussion beforehand, without contact beforehand, at least to make the officer aware of your organization?
I think it never hurts to send an email. If the person hasn't responded to you, they likely aren't the right person to contact, it's not personal. It's just a question of how the community foundation functions. So at my foundation, community foundation, for example, most of the time when my donor services team gets an inquiry about a nonprofit wanting to tell us about who they are, we direct them immediately to the program officers, which we call community research and grants management officers, but it's the same function. So you sending something to me and me forwarding it along to another department it's not personal, it's completely normal. If I were to get an unsolicited half-page, one-page summary, I would very likely say thanks so much and forward it along to the program officers, just because that's how we function. So I think it never hurts from the perspective of, I would not be offended if you sent that to me. The only thing I would caution you is I don't want a fundraiser to dump lots of time into creating this beautiful, concise summary that all they're going to hear in return is thanks, forwarded. So it's really a question for you. If you have attempted to contact and you haven't heard anything, you have to ask yourself the question of whether you want to keep investing time in it or not. And it's entirely up to you. But that's the candid answer about what I think would happen in my community foundation.
Well, flipping to the positive side of that, if somebody has their one pager available, would you like that attached to an email asking you to talk so you've got some background?
That's a great idea, because then even if I'm not available to talk about it, I can still forward it along. I can still make sure that our program officers have heard about this organization. So it at least is something. So if you already have it prepared, by all means, if you're creating it for me, that's the question for you to decide.
Great. All right, I think we have time for one more question, which I hope is not controversial. Someone has asked, what do you think about the DAF Direct widget?
I will say that that is something that we have encouraged organizations to add to their donation pages. It makes it easy for donor advised fund donors to execute a gift, to recognize that your organization is welcoming of and knows how to manage those gifts. So it is a tool that we think can be very useful.
Great. All right, so thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Unfortunately, we have to move on. And Dana, I believe this is back to you.
Sure. So I just want to share before we wrap up that we have a whole host of resources available on our website about grant seeking during this crisis, about today's topic, emergency grant listings for organizations. And so if you haven't already, we encourage you to visit our website. Following today, we will send an email that includes a link to today's recording. and some links to those other resources that I mentioned. So we encourage you to take a look at that and to also sign up to attend our future webinars. We do have one this Friday, I'll mention, that's specifically for museums, emergency grant seeking for museums. So if that applies to you, please join us. And otherwise, we really look forward to having you all with us again in May. So thanks, Chris, so much for joining us today and for everybody who participated.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everyone.